Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most baffling economic mysteries of the modern world. We're going to unpack the fascinating and honestly pretty tragic story of how a country with seemingly limitless potential managed to lose its immense wealth. It's a story that challenges pretty much everything we think we know about economic progress.
Think about it. How does a nation that literally had everything going for it embark on a century-long path of comparative decline? We are talking about a country that didn't suffer a world-ending cataclysm, no apocalyptic wars, yet still experienced a shocking reversal of fortune. How does a society that achieved astonishing wealth just 50 years after its independence get stuck on a path of such persistent stagnation?
The historical contrast is just staggering. At the dawn of the 20th century, specifically by 1896, Argentina had actually achieved remarkable parity with the United States in terms of per capita income. They were an absolute economic powerhouse. But today? Well, their income level is comparable to Russia or Turkey. To put that into perspective, if Argentina continued its current growth trajectory, research notes it would take them over 90 years just to catch up to Switzerland's economy.
Now, when economists look at a massive collapse like this, they usually search for systemic disadvantages. But we can toss out the usual suspects right away. Argentina had the exact same advantages as highly successful places like Canada and Australia. They had vast natural resources, low population density, a temperate climate, and mass immigration. So if geography and resources weren't the problem, what on earth was?
Section 1. The Belle Epoque Economic Boom.
To really grasp the magnitude of this fall, we first have to appreciate the peak. By 1913, Argentina had skyrocketed into the ranks of the 10 wealthiest countries in the entire world. They were easily surpassing nations like Italy, Spain, and Portugal by a massive margin. By the dawn of the 20th century, anyone claiming Argentina was going to become an underdeveloped country would have been laughed right out of the room. They even boasted one of the highest literacy rates on the planet.
The crucial takeaway here is that this boom was no accident. It was built on a really solid foundation of rapid institutional modernization. Following their independence from Spain and a messy period of civil war, Argentina promulgated a constitution in 1853. And this wasn't just any constitution. It was modeled directly on James Madison's Republican division of powers, meaning a strong executive branch, 2 legislative chambers, and an independent judiciary. Pair that with modern commercial codes, a sprawling new railway system, and a huge influx of foreign capital and labor, and you essentially have the perfect recipe for an economic miracle.
Section 2. The 1930 Institutional Breakdown.
This is where the story takes a very dark turn, and it leads us directly to the actual culprit behind the decline. Because unlike the US, Canada, or Australia, Argentina never truly finished its transition to an open democracy supported by the rule of law. Looking at the economic data and historical research from Romsperk, the real cause of the decline was the systematic destruction of political institutions. The constitutional rules were written down on paper, sure, but the informal everyday norms required to actually uphold them, they simply failed to take root. You can see this maddening whiplash between weak democracies and dictatorships laid out historically. In 1912, the Sáenz-Peña Law introduced a secret ballot, sparking a real push for democratic participation. But that window closed fast. In 1930, a conservative military coup completely shattered the constitutional order. This kicked off what's known as the infamous decade of electoral fraud and set a devastating precedent. From that moment on, the country was just caught in an endless, destructive loop of institutional breakdowns.
Section 3. Populism and Purging the Court.
Let's look at exactly how these institutions were dismantled from the inside out, particularly during the highly influential era of Juan Perón in the 1940s and 50s. According to the research, Peronist policies used a very specific playbook to systematically replace constitutional checks and balances with government-backed favoritism. Under the banner of social justice, widespread rent-seeking was heavily encouraged over productive economic activity. They nationalized businesses mostly just to dole out jobs as political rewards, implemented heavy price and rent controls that completely warped property rights, and, most critically, they went directly after the courts.
The sheer scale of this judicial purge is truly eye-opening. Just look at the blatant political capture here. Before 1945, there were 38 changes in Supreme Court justices, almost entirely due to natural deaths or voluntary retirements. Normal stuff, right? But during the Perón era, from 1946 to 1955, there were a staggering 65 changes. And get this, Only 5 of those were natural deaths or retirements. The vast majority were forced resignations, impeachments, and forced removals. They completely eliminated the ultimate check on the abuse of power by swapping out independent justices for political allies.
Section 4. The vicious cycle of dictatorships.
Once that constitutional seal was broken and the courts were captured, Argentina plunged into a very dark era. Without an independent court to peacefully resolve conflicts, the institutional vacuum had devastating real-world consequences. The country suffered through brutal military dictatorships, including the 1976 junta, which committed severe human rights abuses and operated clandestine jails. Economically, the nation was paralyzed. Rampant inflation, intense macroeconomic instability, and a persistent lack of property rights meant the entire system for creating and protecting wealth just eroded away.
Section 5. What if Argentina stayed rich?
This brings us to the fascinating what-if hidden deep in the economic math of the source material. What if Argentina had never abandoned its constitutional foundations? The study deploys a synthetic control model, which is basically just advanced economic math used to calculate an alternate reality. It shows that if Argentina had simply maintained inclusive U.S.-style institutions, meaning genuine rule of law, independent courts, and stable property rights, they would have seen a consistent year-over-year per capita increase of 1.8 to 2.6%.
To pull that dense econometric math out of the clouds and put it into perspective, in a parallel universe where those institutional breakdowns never happened, where the 1930 coup and the purges of the courts were avoided, Argentina today would not be a middle-income country battling runaway inflation. It would be among the absolute richest countries in the world, boasting an income level similar to that of New Zealand today. That is the cost of broken institutions.
There's a powerful quote from the historical literature that perfectly captures the core lesson of this entire explainer. As long as they could stay in power, the oligarchs maintained the veneer of a liberal order. But as soon as they started to lose power, the proverbial iron fist broke out. It shows how incredibly fragile a nation's prosperity really is. When democratic norms are merely a superficial veneer for those in power and not deeply held societal values, they get discarded the second they become inconvenient. That iron fist of the 1930 military coup destroyed a framework that took decades of hard work to build.
So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with something to reflect on regarding your own nation's rule of law. Look closely at the institutions that guarantee your property rights, your independent courts, and your peaceful transitions of power. Are they built on a solid, unbreakable foundation, or are you just one crisis away from the iron fist? It's definitely a sobering question. But as the great Argentine economic mystery shows us, it's one every single wealthy nation must eventually answer.